What's going on? My name is Andron, and today we're going to be building a Flutter application that can pass data to an iOS widget and display the information on your iPhone's home screen. The widget will be built using SwiftUI, and we'll be getting help from the Flutter Widget Kit package to pass the data from Flutter to the SwiftUI view. In order to get started, you will need to have access to a Mac computer and have Xcode, Flutter, and Dart installed. Let's get started. All right, so getting started, let's create a new Flutter project, and let's just delete all this boilerplate code that gets auto-generated. And within the main function, let's go ahead and replace the boilerplate my app with a material app, and let's provide a home of text page. Now, underneath the main function, let's create a new widget, and let's call it text page. And within that text page state, within the build method, we're going to want to go ahead and return a scaffold. And that scaffold will have a body of a center. And that center will have a child, which is a column. And the children will be a text field. And it will be a elevated button. The onPressed command will have nothing in it for the time being, but we'll go through and add that functionality later. And then the child for the elevated button will just be a text widget. And then within here, let's go ahead and just say push to widget. Now, because we have a column in here, our scaffold cannot be constant. Let's delete that, save and reload. And if you run into an issue where this happens after kind of deleting all that boilerplate code, I've noticed sometimes it doesn't really work the way you expect it to. So the best way to solve this is just to kind of close the current project, close the current running of the application, and then just rerun the application. All right, cool, looks like that fixed the issue, but right now all of our content within our column is pushed to the top. So within our column, let's go ahead and provide a main axis alignment. And the main axis alignment is going to be the one that's responsible for the vertical axis in a column. So we'll say main axis alignment is equal to main axis alignment.center. Now if we save that and reload, we should see that it pushes it down into the middle. And the other thing we're going to want to do is make sure that we have a text editing controller to basically be able to extract the information from our text field. So within our text page state, let's create a new variable called text controller, and we'll set that equal to a text editing controller. And within our text field, we'll create a new controller and just pass that in there. So we're not going to see much of a visual change here, but this will be able to now basically keep track of what is inside of that text field. So when we're done with the core functionality of this application, we'll go back and style it the way we saw it earlier. But for the time being, let's keep this as simple as possible so that way we can focus on the actual passing of data between the widget and the Flutter application. So the only data that we're going to be passing is a string of text to the widget. So underneath our text page state class, let's go ahead and just create a new class called widget data. Make sure we're spelling that right. Widget data, and we're going to have a final string called text, and we're going to have a constructor for our widget data, and then it will just set it to this .text. So now that we have the basic setup for our widget data class, we're going to want to add two functions that help convert our class to a JSON representation. And what this does is it enables us to send an instance, or at least what is somewhat of an instance of this data class, to the widget in the form of a JSON string that could be parsed by the SwiftUI code. So underneath the constructor, let's go ahead and say widget data dot from JSON, and we're going to map of string and dynamic. We're going to call that JSON. We're going to set the text equal to JSON text. And now we're going to want to convert this to JSON. So what we're going to do is say map, and same deal here, string dynamic. And we're going to call this to JSON. And this will convert our data object to JSON. And we will say text is equal to whatever the text is in our object. So this is all we're going to need to represent the data that we're sending to the widget from our application. The last thing we're going to want to do within our Flutter project is actually just kind of hop into the terminal. So we're going to hop into the terminal and add our dependency. So in order to get this to work, we're going to be using a Flutter package called Widget Kit. So we're going to do Flutter pub add, and then Flutter underscore widget kit. Now this is going to add the dependency to your pubspec.yaml file. You could also just go ahead and add Flutter Widget Kit 1.0.3 to your dependencies list if you'd like to do that instead. All right, so hopping back into our main.dart file, let's go ahead and build out the elevated buttons on press listener to send the information over to the widget. So within here, we're going to use the widget kit that we had just imported, and we're going to set an item. So for this item, we're going to provide a key, and we're going to call this widget data. That's going to be the key that we're going to receive on the Xcode side. The value is going to be the data that we want to send. So we're going to want to send a JSON encoded instance of our object. So we'll say JSON encode, and we will pass in our widget data. And the widget data is text. For the constructor, we'll just take whatever's inside of our text controller. So whatever's currently entered into our text field, we'll create a new object for widget data and then send that over. So we'll say text controller.text. Okay, we also have to make sure that we have Dart convert imported as well. And this part is extremely important. We're going to want to go ahead and provide an app group. Now, we'll actually finish setting up this app group in Xcode in just a second. But for the time being, for app group, just provide something like group.yourname. So I'll just use group.flutter iOS widget. And now with that all set up, all we want to do is after this set item call, what we're going to do is say widget kit dot reload all timelines. And what this is going to do is basically tell your phone or your simulator that it's time to reload the timelines, and doing so will also capture this information that you had just sent over to the widget, and it will display it onto the screen. All right, so now we're done with the Flutter side of this project. What we're going to want to do now is create the iOS widget that will be displayed on the iPhone. It's home screen. So what we're going to do is in our project navigator, just right-click iOS and go ahead and open in Xcode. So this will launch our project in Xcode. You can also just navigate into the iOS project path and open up the XC workspace file. So now inside of Xcode, we can go ahead and create a new target by selecting runner. And on the bottom left-hand corner, we can create a new target and just search for widget extension and just provide a generic name like iOS widget Flutter. And we're not going to include live activity, but we will include configuration intent and hit finish. And we can go ahead and activate the scheme. So before we move on and accept the data from our Flutter application, we're going to need to do something very important. We're going to have to assign app groups to these targets. If we don't do this, it will not work. So what we're going to want to do is underneath the target section, select that Flutter widget extension that we had just created and add a new capability. Now this capability that we're going to want to add is an app group. So we just search for app group. We'll see that it shows up. And this is where we want to make sure that the app group that we create, you can go ahead and create a new app group by just including the prefix group and then dot whatever your app group is. And it is very important that this app group matches what you have in your Flutter application. So here I have group.flutter iOS widget. It's very important to make sure that these two match. If they don't match, it will not work. So in addition to adding this to the target extension that we had just created, let's go ahead and hop over to our runner and add the similar capability. So we're going to add the new capability of an app group, and we're going to specify the Flutter iOS widget app group. So now that we have done this, it will actually work. This will give it the ability to pass data back and forth between this app group. All right, so with that done, we can now go ahead and actually create the SwiftUI view and accept the data from our Flutter application. What we're going to want to do is just navigate over to the file that we had created earlier with the widget extension, and we're going to want to go into the iOS widget Flutter file or whichever file that has a provider in it. What we're going to do is just kind of delete everything in here, and we'll just go step by step, kind of talking about what everything does. So inside of this empty file, let's go ahead and start by creating our representation of the data that we had created earlier. So let's create a struct called widget data, and this widget data needs to be decodable and also needs to be hashable. And this data will just have one data member, and that would be a string that is called text. All right, so next we're going to want to go ahead and create a timeline entry. So let's create another struct called Flutter entry, and this will extend timeline entry. And this timeline entry will have a date. And it will also have a instance of widget data, and it will be nullable. So we'll say let widget data equals widget data, and we can null it, make it a nullable type. All right, so now let's go ahead and create our provider struct. So let's go ahead and create a new struct called provider, and this will be a timeline provider. And we're gonna want three separate different kinds of functions in here. The first one that we're gonna want is a placeholder. So this is going to return a placeholder for our iOS widget. So this placeholder returns a Flutter entry, which is why we created this timeline entry previously. And within it, what we're going to do is just kind of create our own Flutter entry with kind of like some default values. Now below that, we're going to create this get snapshot function as well, which is going to be pretty similar to what's going on here, but it's going to be like a snapshot instance of our Flutter entry. And underneath that is where it gets more important. So what we're going to do is create a get timeline function. And here's the get timeline function. So what it's doing here is it's going to be using the shared defaults and the user defaults, and we're going to be passing in our app group that we had specified earlier. Again, it's very important that these app groups match all along the way. So inside of your Flutter project, inside of the actual targets, and inside of your iOS widget extension files, it's very important that all of the app groups equal out to being the same thing. So now what we're going to do also is create a new instance of Flutter data, and we're going to try to decode an instance of widget data from self, and we're going to be pulling this in from our shared defaults, and we're accepting in the JSON string for the key widget data, which is what we also had specified earlier inside of our Flutter application. So if we're for some reason unable to do that, we're just going to default it to an empty data instance. But now what we can do is say entry date is equal to just the current date, and we can pass in these dates right now, and we can actually create a valid instance of our Flutter entry with our current date, as well as with the Flutter data that we had decoded from the app group shared defaults. And this function get timeline is called every single time we tap that button. So when we tap the push to widget button, it's going to call this get timeline, which will update the widget on our home screen. All right, so now underneath the provider, we're going to want to create a widget and a view. Now the difference between these two is that the widget is what's going to display within the list of widgets available to your phone. And there's also going to be the actual view that we're creating, which is going to have the content that we see right here and actually display on your phone when you have it added to your home screen. So the first thing we're going to want to do is create the widget. So let's create a widget, and let's just call it the same thing that we called the name of the file. So you can see if you go into the bundle, it will be expecting it to be named that. Let's just go ahead and keep that naming consistent. So we'll just have a struct and iOS widget Flutter, or whatever you name the file. And this will be our widget. And this widget will have a kind associated to it. So we'll say let kind. That's going to be a string, kind, not king. And we'll set that equal to iOS widget Flutter. And underneath that, we're going to specify a body. We'll say body is going to be some widget configuration. And that widget configuration will have a static configuration. And we're going to pass in the kind that we had specified earlier. We're going to pass in an instance of a provider. And we're also just going to have an entry. And each entry will basically create an instance of a view that will pass in the entry. So at this point, we now have an entry that can be passed in, and it's just going to be one of these Flutter entries that we had created earlier. So at this point, we're going to have to create a view, and this view will actually be what's represented on our application's home screen. So underneath this struct, let's go ahead and create one more. So we'll create a new struct called iOS widget view, and this will just be a view. And we're also going to specify an entry. So we'll say our entry is a provider entry. And we're also going to specify a body for this view as well. So let's go ahead and say our body is some view. And here all we have to do is pass in the text. And the text will just be the information that's inside of our widget data, which is just a text string. So what we're going to do is say text is equal to entry.widget data, but because this is a nullable type, it may not be there. So in the event that it's not available, we'll just provide a default value of tap to set message, because if there's no data, that means nothing has been sent yet. So we'll just provide a default value of tap to set message. Now we can hop back into our iOS widget, Flutter widget, or whatever you called it, and we can pass in this view into here. So now we can say iOS widget view, and we can just pass in that entry. And that's just about it. So now with this done, what we're going to want to do is just hop back into VS Code or wherever your terminal is, and let's just stop it if it's running, and let's just go ahead and rebuild it. So let's just run Flutter run. And one more time, if you experience some kind of issue to where it's not passing the data back and forth, make sure that this app group and the key is consistent on all sides. So make sure that this app group is in both of the targets. You should see it selected, and the name is matching in both targets. And the actual key for the data should match. So you can see the widget data key is here for our shared defaults or for our app group. And what we're going to want to do is make sure that it matches in VS Code or wherever your Flutter project is, and make sure that it matches the key specified there as well. All right, so now before we actually push any data to the widget, let's just go ahead and make sure everything's working as expected. So let's go to our home screen. And if you click and hold on your simulator and hit this plus button, you should be able to search for widgets, and then just search for the name of the target that you had created earlier. So we created the iOS Flutter widget target. So if you click that, you should see that the values that you specified inside of the placeholder and snapshot will actually just be provided into here. And and if you hit add widget, you should see that the default value that we kind of set it to, tap to set message, shows up. Now if we click on this, and then it will open up our application, if we pass in a default message like, hey, what's up? If we push that to our widget and go back to our home screen, it updates the widget. So basically this was a pretty simple way of just passing data in from our Flutter project to our iOS widget that's available on our home screen. This was just passing over a string, but you can imagine how you can pass in a lot more data and start creating views like this. And then you can maybe learn a little bit more SwiftUI. And if you're unfamiliar with SwiftUI, getting a little bit more knowledge about how SwiftUI works would give you the ability to kind of build a lot more into that widget view. All right, now before we finish up, let's go ahead and just style up our application a little bit to make it look a little better. Within our text field, let's just go ahead and wrap it in a sized box and provide a width of, say, 250. Save that and reload. Already looking a little better. We can provide that little X button that clears out whatever's in the text field. So what we can do is provide a declaration to our text field. And it's going to be an input declaration. And it's going to have a suffix icon. And the suffix icon is going to be an icon button. The icon button will have an icon of icons.clear. Now we also need to make sure that our icon button has a onPress listener built in. Now we also want to make sure that our icon button has an onPress listener. So we'll say onPressed. We're going to go to our text controller and we're going to clear it. So every time we tap the icon button that's inside of the suffix icon. So now with the suffix icon specified to being an icon button, whenever we press on it, it's going to clear the text controller, which gives it the ability to just kind of clear whatever's inside of that text controller and delete the contents of the text field. So if we save this and reload it, we can see that this is now available. If we tap that, it removes it. One other thing we can do is just provide a little bit of hint text. So we'll say inside of our input declaration, we'll say hint text is equal to enter widget text. So if we save that and reload, now we have some basic default set up in there. And the last thing we can do is just give a little bit of room between the button and the text field. So above the elevated button, let's go ahead and just provide a sized box, and let's give it a height of about 10 or so. So yeah, that about does it. We can now go ahead and pass data to our iOS widget using Flutter. We push that to the widget and go to the home page. We'll see that it's in there now. Thanks for watching. I hope this helped. I'll have a link to the GitHub repository down below. And yeah, take care. Peace.